Buenas tardes a todos los que están conectados a las 6:30. Nosotros solemos premiar la puntualidad virtual de los asistentes a los eventos del Centro Cultural Cayena y de todo el área cultural de la Universidad del Norte. Mi nombre es Tony Celia, yo soy el director del Centro Cultural Cayena. Quiero darle las gracias a todos los que están conectados por acompañarnos hoy en esta charla que hemos denominado Mío, Tuyo y de Todos, el rol del arte en el espacio público. Esto es una charla que se dio o se empezó a cranear hace unas semanas y hace unos meses a raíz de ciertas conversaciones que se están teniendo en Estados Unidos alrededor del tema de los monumentos y el arte en espacio público. ¿Qué historia queremos contar? ¿Qué tipo o no de marca se quiere crear alrededor de los elementos y las diferentes manifestaciones artísticas en el espacio público? ¿Quién financia? ¿Quién no? ¿Quién escoge? ¿Qué es arte en espacio público? Etcétera, etcétera. Son varias de las preguntas que hemos planteado para la charla de hoy. Tenemos unos invitados maravillosos que les he dado las gracias en tras bambalinas, pero quiero aprovechar que estamos al aire para dar las gracias a mucha gente. Quiero dar las gracias a todo el equipo de Cayena, a todo el equipo del área cultural por siempre apoyarnos. Gracias a la gente que se está conectando y que toma un momento de su día para interesarse en estas discusiones un poco diagonales, un poco a veces controversiales alrededor del tema de cultura y producción artística. Nosotros no solemos hacer cosas en la universidad menos que sintamos realmente de manera muy modesta que estamos agregándole algo a la conversación y no sencillamente le estamos agregando al ruido que ya de por sí nos agobia y existe todos los días. Entonces, muchas gracias por confiar en nosotros, por confiar en que les tenemos un contenido interesante. Hoy tenemos de invitados a Emiliano Valdés, quien es el curador en jefe del Museo de Arte Moderno de Medellín, una persona muy interesante que tiene un proceso curatorial muy sofisticado, muy fino, y no me refiero eso en un sentido soberbio ni pretencioso, sino al contrario, de una manera muy redonda de pensar en el arte, de una manera muy abierta y muy incluyente de pensar en el arte. Entonces, para mí, un verdadero honor contar con Emiliano en esta charla, y tenemos también a Kendall Henry desde Nueva York, que nos va a estar acompañando. Él es el director de Present for Art, una organización que se encarga, y esto lo va a explicar él un poco más, en curar lo que es el arte en espacio público en Nueva York. Y además fue ex curador en jefe del MOCADA, que es el Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Diásporas Africanas. Es una persona muy interesante, muy importante también en el trabajo que ha hecho los últimos 30 años en el arte en espacio público, y por supuesto va a estar moderado por Andrés Oyaga Loevi, un arquitecto de Barranquilla, quien vivió muchos años en Nueva York, trabajó en muchos proyectos en Nueva York, así como en Tailandia, en Holanda. Es una persona con una sensibilidad muy particular sobre el urbanismo y la intersección de urbanismo, cultura y arte. Así que, francamente, es un line-up bien interesante. Vuelvo a lo mismo, les quiero dar las gracias. Y para los que no sabían, que hicimos mucho hincapié en esto, pero esta charla va a ser en inglés por la presencia y el acompañamiento de Kendall Henry. So I'm going to switch to English now, so people that are coming in know that this is a chat that's going to be in English. And we want to thank you again, everybody, for joining us and tuning in this Wednesday at 6:34 p.m. Without further ado, here's Andrés Oyaga, our moderator for the night, and thank you.
Hi, hola a todos. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the chat. Like Tony said, we're very honored today to have Emiliano and Kendall. Emiliano runs, I would say, probably one of the most prestigious and probably a model of cultural institution and program in Colombia. And Kendall is the director of the Present for Art program in New York, and has also directed other art programs in New York before, which I've had the privilege to encounter in my day to day. So we're going to be speaking today about public art. I think public art has many meanings, but there is something that remains constant, and it's the fact that public art occupies public space. I mean, it's freely accessible to everybody, and it's supposed to be. And I think despite today we have a lot of access to museums and art digitally, many people actually don't go, and it's actually through public art that people come in contact with it, really on a daily day basis, and also the fact that it is outside the bounds of a conventional gallery or museum poses a different kind of relationship with that art, in the sense that it is not imposed. It can be questioned because it resides in a public space. I think the best way to start this conversation is perhaps to talk about the difference between what is public art versus what is art in public space. I mean, what makes public art public and not just simply art in public space?
Okay, I think I'm going to tackle that first. Hi, Andres and Emilio. Good to meet you all here. So that is a very important question, and this is something that, you know, in the program that I run here in New York, that we sort of go with back and forth. And as you mentioned earlier, yeah, public art is just basically art in anything that's public. But we actually have a technical term when we say public art and when we describe art in public place. Like you mentioned, yes, many of our cities have many different galleries and museums, but unfortunately, people, for many different reasons, aren't going into those museums. Sometimes they're a little bit more expensive. Sometimes they don't have time. People have lives to live. You know, art is not something that they necessarily experience on a day-to-day basis. So taking that artwork and putting it outside in the public environment is our just rough definition of art in public place. One is not better than the other. It's just giving access, like you mentioned before, to the art that's in a space, that's in a museum or gallery, but giving the public an opportunity to experience it. Now, when we start talking about public art, the way we define public art is sort of the convergence of the public, the space, and the art coming together to create something that's site-specific. And that's a very important term, because and that's a very loose term as well. Site-specific could relate to many different parts of the site. It could relate to the architecture of the space. It could relate to the history. It could relate to the audience. But you know, that's the difference between when we say art in public place and public art. So when you create a public artwork, if you remove it from its intended location, it may no longer make sense. So that's a different way of defining it.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Tony, for the invitation, and Andres, both of you, for the way to generous introduction. And Kendall, it's great to be in conversation with you. I'm, by no means expert in either public art or art in the public space, but we have developed some programs. And I completely agree with what Kendall was saying about the difference between these two kinds of practices, though I also believe that each of them plays a very significant role in the accessibility of art to people. Recently, at the end of last year, we installed a large sculpture of a Swiss artist living in New York, Ugo Rondinone, in a public park here in Medellin. And while I would think that falls into the category of art in the public space, because at the end of the day, it's a sort of self-contained sculpture, which relates to the environment in the way, that such a big piece of art would in a public park. It's also, in a way, has its own logic and its own mysticism and its own sort of ideology. But talking to Ugo, something really interesting happened, and the piece, I don't know if we might want to look at it. It's one of the images that I shared. He says that art in the public space is most likely the first time that the vast majority of people are going to encounter art in their lives, whether it's a sculpture or a monument, or something that perhaps is closer to the way we think about public art, which might be a performance or an intervention in the public space, but that whatever the situation is, and we're talking about the majority of the population, may not museum goers or people that are prone to go to an art institution or a gallery or a performance, but rather just the general audience, how that first encounter tends to be really significant in the way that people will relate to art afterwards. And so I think that when working in the public space, it's really, or it has been for us to sort of tackle and address the different audiences that exist in the public space, which are endless, which in turn becomes something of like a, you know, failed attempt because it's so large, so you really cannot address all of them. But that the different types of project that you will insert in that environment will surely generate and touch different audiences in different contexts. So this just to say that, you know, I think I completely agree with the distinction, but at the same time, I feel like, you know, isn't it at the end, whatever you do in the public space, something that through art is going to try to engage people into, you know, a conversation that has to do probably with the experience that they're having at that moment.
I think that's a very interesting point of view, and I also agree, and you might even say that maybe sometimes art in a public space can become public art in time, like if it actually, if context sort of envelopes it and receives it and accepts it and makes it theirs, right? So there's also a little bit of a blurry line there between those two categories. I think, Kendall, you've probably through the MTA and through the Percent for Art program have done a little bit of both in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've dealt with it?
Yeah, and so I just want to, you know, latch on to what Emiliano had said. Yeah, it just a mere fact of it's bringing the art in the public environment, that's important, no matter what it's called. And so the distinction was just for our purposes to sort of really understand how we approach a project, which is very different in terms of how we engage the community in that project as well. So one of the projects that we just installed the other day, well, the other day now, it's November, was a piece called Unity by an artist, Hank Willis Thomas. And it's basically a giant arm, and I think I have a photo of that. And the art, that particular project wasn't sort of speaking to anything in particular. It was just sort of the artist making a statement, artist taking his work and what he talks about in his work in general and putting it out into the public environment and engaging with people, and had many different meanings. But and there it is right there on the screen. So what has been happening, I'm sure, like you've heard, there's so many different protests in New York after the murder of George Floyd. What's been happening is that people have been congregating around that particular statue, that particular sculpture, and emulating the gesture, because that gesture means a lot more. It has a lot of meanings, yes, but the meaning sort of became truncated as to represent, you know, unity, as to represent, you know, the power of congregating. And so now what we intended to be just a sculpture representing an artist's work ended up being something very specific of the time, and how people are, you know, drawn to it, and it becomes this meaning all of a sudden, this very specific meaning all of a sudden. So this is a very quick turnaround of a project that was installed late last year, and how it, because of what's happening in the time now, how it now has an identifier with it. So every time you see that now, you kind of remember what's been happening around now. You kind of remember that this sort of there's an identity for this time, when that may not have been the original intent, or an intent in general. So that's to sort of talk about how you go in with one idea and it has a different interpretation as the times around it has changed. That sort of speak to that very closely.
I would, I completely resonate with that, and just think about the sort of the percentage of, or the margin for not error at all, but just for unforeseen results of working in the public sphere is so much larger than it is working inside the gallery, which is a way more controlled space, no? But it's precisely sort of that possibility for the unknown, and for, I think, for people really owning and relating to your action or your piece or your sculpture or to whatever it is, that makes, you know, working there both risky but also incredibly powerful, no? But also like, I feel that whenever something when you do something in the public space and you don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be, or when the outcome is in fact contradictory or problematic, you know, it's when you can use that situation to to discuss things, whether related to art or to the topics and interests of the work in question.
Mm-hmm. But I think the important part of that is sort of like when that, because like you said, you know, we all pray that it's always positive, but half the time the interpretation may not be what is intended for the work to, you know, and so, but when that misinterpretation or the controversy that happens, then, you know, we have to think about how do we engage in that kind of conversation where it's valuable to the public and to the artists and to the idea of putting art in public space. So you know, that's something that we'll be interested in for any type of public artwork. So
I think the idea that you both brought up in a way of the public's reaction and ownership of the public art or the art in public space is also sort of a critical component here, especially because of what you've mentioned to me earlier, that it's only until fairly recently that public art is actually a little bit more public, in the sense that people are starting to be able to actually participate in it, because for a long time public art was actually, let's say, controlled or decided by the elite or by a curator or by the powers that be, right? So these are exciting times for public art, and I think I'd like for both of you to talk a little bit about that, about public engagement and how you actually make the public artwork a little bit closer to the people around them by engaging with the community.
Mm-hmm. You want to start with that? Yeah, so I'll start. Okay.
Sorry.
So one of the things that when we do public art, people always ask, how do you gauge the success of that public artwork, right? And back in the day when we started doing it, if it was there, if you put it up on a Monday and it's there on a Wednesday, successful. You know, that meant that people didn't damage it, that people sort of, and you know, cared about it enough to leave it alone. But that's not a good way to gauge something, right? So we needed to come up with a way and sort of alleviate all the misinterpretations as to what the artwork is. A lot of times, because most of the public do not go into museums and galleries, a lot of times, you know, our level of art education is very different than, you know, the layman's level of art education. You know, we need to have a process in place where we could explain to people what we're doing, explain to people what public art is, because again, it's usually when you say let's do public art, people think of a mural, people think of a sculpture on a pedestal. And, you know, we want to go way beyond that. And we want to, like Emiliano said before, it could be performative. It could be, you know, a play, a dance in the public environment. So to really expand people's idea of what public art is. So that conversation, that bit of education needs to happen with the agency or the people that's doing public art and the people that they're doing public art for, first of all. And so once that's done, then you start talking about, you know, what is this artwork for? Why are we putting this in the public environment in the first place? And is what my idea of what it needs to be the same as to the people that we're doing it for? And most of the time I do public artwork all over the city, and I live in one part of the city. So for me to understand what that community's needs are with artwork, or what the art is meant to do, I need to talk to them, and they need to talk. We need to have a conversation. We need to have a discussion before we even start talking about what the artwork is. So that conversation and that engagement needs to happen. So I understand what I need to do. I need to understand what level of education I need to put forward on both sides. Some neighborhoods maybe, you know, I may be very familiar with because of my background. Others I know nothing about. So they need to educate me. I need to educate them. It's into back and forth. So all these different kinds of things need to happen before we start saying, let's put an artwork in your place, in your space, in your neighborhood. Otherwise, it's just not going to work out. And as a result of doing all that legwork before you even look at art, you have these conversations. You have a better level of you don't have a level of misinterpretation of what the artwork is, and you have a better level of ownership, which is what you hope to get whenever you do a public artwork, in my opinion.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, there are so many different levels and so many degrees of exposure and engagement with one particular work of art, no? So, you know, a sculpture that has been installed or a bust that has been installed in a particular place of the city might have encountered literally millions of people along its lifetime, and something that happens briefly as a performance or as an action in the middle of the street will only meet or impact or engage with a certain amount of people. This is part of a series of art interventions in the public space that we did last year, and this is a work by a Colombian artist called Juan Obando, in which he was discussing issues of just the precariousness of work related to apps. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is a structure that people here in Colombia and in other countries in Latin America use to do advertisement. So instead of actually carrying advertising, he replaced them with these orange squares with which they made these choreographies in the middle of the street. And it's very likely that a lot of people that passed through that corner at the moment that these performers were doing their dance and their choreography and their composition in space. In fact, you know, it's a very artistic exercise in the sense that it's a matter of like composition and time and color and figure over background, etc. But it's very likely that a lot of them will never know you know, about the work, about the artist, or about what he was trying to say, and that perhaps a very small minority will try to Google it or Instagram it or hashtag it or do something. And at the same time, you know, there was obviously some of the captive audience of the museum and the art-related people that would have, that were there. You can see them, you know, on the left of the image, far in the back, just looking at the performance. And I think that's inevitable, and that's also fair enough. You know, some people will be closer to those ideas, and some people will more likely be more open to just a single sculpture in a corner, and to the discourses that each of those works that are so dramatically different will put out out in the world.
Mm-hmm. You're on mute.
There we go. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing in both cases, because you say there's a certain engagement with the public in order to be able to cater the artwork to that public. At the same time, Emiliano is saying that there are some artworks that are basically not catered to a specific audience because they might be transient, because they might be in a public space where the audience is so wide that it's impossible to actually cater to a specific group. But we've talked a little bit about what the artwork should do. I think maybe just to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, what would you consider a public piece of art or a public artwork should not do? What would be an example of a bad public? I think
I can go first this time. I think it should not reinforce narratives that in any way discriminate or work against any group of people or any situation that in any way will, you know, lead us back in a road to, I don't know, you know, the consecution of human rights and a more profound and open humanity. And I know that's super vague, you know, and a little naive perhaps. But I think, yeah, what Kendall was saying at the beginning, and just what has been happening with the statues of either Confederate leaders in the United States or, you know, other figures, it's a clear representation of that. You know, people are, I think, really ready to not take it anymore, and I think from our institutions, which I tend to believe that most art institutions in the world do intend to work for a better world, in a very wide sense.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with that, because I don't know that. Yeah, I was going to say something, but I'm taking it back now. But I don't know that. I was going to say, I don't know that people intentionally do works that that sort of do what Emiliana was saying that it shouldn't do. But then, because public art has been being looked at very closely lately, what we're recognizing is that yes, actually, there is a history of that kind of work that's being placed out there, and that's why we're trying to get it out. That's why we're trying to remove it from our from our cities and our environments. So when we recognize that, I don't know. So for here in the United States, there's a lot of the removal of a lot of Confederate monuments, for example, and these monuments were placed there way after the Civil War, and to sort of really subvert the African American or the people of color in that specific kind of way. So people are recognizing that's what they were placed there for, and then they're beginning to be removed, or individuals or statues to individuals who were praised for being discoverers and really important folks within the culture, but their lives were less than stellar in or even more so negative than positive. So these are being removed. So we're now thinking about who are we representing in our space? What are we representing in our space? Because we are recognizing that the space belongs to all of us, and not just the people who are the rich folks who could afford it, or the rich folks who own the spaces. So so that's an interesting question, because as I'm talking here, I'm thinking about how other things are misinterpreted that that leads for things to be removed as well. But it's a different kind of, so it's a very, we could talk about this for hours and hours, because it's just you could write a thesis about it, frankly. But yeah, it's important to think about that as well.
And I think it's I mean, I totally agree. I do think that people can be, I wouldn't say even evil, they will just fight for their interests, and usually power and the money and the power that derives from money is one of those interests, and if I have to do anything, whether it's slay people or put my ideology out in the public space to maintain that status quo, I think people will tend to do it. And I feel that a lot of the historical sculpture has had to do about that, and that we are entering, we have, for the past, I don't know how many decades, but into a phase in which the public space is not anymore the property of just the governments, in which whatever discourses are placed there, it's also something that people are not anymore just simply subject to, but something that they will have things to say about. And I feel that placing a work of art in the public space, in a way, is like introducing a little virus, like a little glitch. And if that works, that will introduce certain ideas, probably very, in a very subtle way, but it will start generating conversations. And that's not only about historical facts or historical narratives, it can also be about other kinds of values. So maybe we can put that image of the Ugo Rondinone sculpture now, just to speak about how by placing something, you can also sort of communicate an intention, no? And that particular sculpture, I think it's so elementary. I mean, it's so basic, it's so simple, it's so childish in a way. But it's precisely that quality of being childish what we wanted to introduce. I mean, what the artists want to introduce, but I suppose backed by the institutions or the people that made it possible. It was to say, art can be childish. It can be about playing with colors and little blocks the way you used to when you were a kid with putty, and that is an idea that you want to introduce there, and that can be in fact, this sculpture had also its detractors. You know, people say like, "Oh yeah, you know, my kid could have done that." You know, that kind of a relationship with contemporary art. But at the same time, it's saying, yeah, I mean, he could have, you know, and that's a beautiful thing about that, going back to very basic ideals. I mean, it can be as complex as, countering a historical narrative that has been, you know, oppressive to parts of the population, but it can also be about a certain moment of relating to, you know, a sense of when you were a kid and you were playing with your colors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the other side of that, and you know, I'm glad you showed this work, because it's there's something about 1 second here. On the other side of that, so I included in the images that I sent a project that worked on many years ago, where the artist John Ahern worked in this community in the South Bronx. And you know, when we do public artwork, and like I said before, it's about the people that it's made for in the space and all that kind of thing. And so this artist lived in this community, and I'll explain what it is that you're looking at, because it's hard to see here. But you know, his work is really making actual casts of people in the community, and he was commissioned by us to do a work in front of a police station. And so he did we selected him for what he does. So him with a group of other people in the community selected 3 individuals to represent that community, and put them on a pedestal. So the idea of the sort of historic idea of putting a person on the pedestal, really elevating them where you sort of look up at them, you know, has been relegated for, you know, kings and queens and, you know, emperors and, you know, generals of wars and whatnot. And so the idea of putting these folks, these, you know, one is a guy with a hoodie and his pit bull, the other is a girl on a roller skates, and this other guy with a basketball and a boombox. This was done in the 80s, so that's had boomboxes. In the 90s, so they had boomboxes. So the idea of putting them on that pedestal bothered a lot of people, because they were like, who are these people to be elevated on that level? Who are these people to sort of have that recognition? These were not, you know. And so this work was one of the works that went up on a Saturday, and by the Monday it was removed because of the outcry of people outside of that community. People who felt, well, you know, these should not be this. We heard stuff like, oh, this is the kid that would rob me, mug me on the street. This is the little girl that, you know, she would skip school, and this guy is too fat, and you know, he needs to lose weight, and all these ridiculous things. And so this is created by an artist for his community, by his community, and people outside that community who had a bit of power wielded that power, and you know, the pieces were removed, and now they live in the other image of that piece. They live in a park, a sculpture park in Queens in New York. So, you know, as much as we we want to create conversations about, you know, who gets to be in the public environment, who gets to be represented, you know, there's still this clash between the artist and the individual and the people in power. And this is a good example of how, you know, how that played out in you know, against the artist. Now the artist, when we were working with the artist, we said we will fight with you on this, but you know, race also played a part into that as well, because this artist is a white guy and all the representatives are, you know, are Black kids, because that's who live there. And so he didn't want to play that race game. So he said, let's take it down. And it has been removed since 1991, and it's still, you know, not placed up where it belongs.
So sorry, just to understand completely, it was the outcry was by people outside of the community. I imagine the community would have welcomed the work.
Yeah, the community loved it. They, you know, they selected these 3 individuals. You know, it was about them. They felt that where it was in. So the South Bronx now, how you define community is a different. You know, everybody defines community a different way. We don't throw that word out all the time as a community and think everybody's going to get along. But in the South Bronx, if you live in these few blocks, that's your community. If you live outside of that, no, not so much. So that was the understanding. That was how they came together to create this work. But once it went up, again, went through all our processes, the whole conversation about working with community, all that worked. It went up. Then you had the elected official, and the woman who lived up the street and around the block, and the people who lived in Queens and in Brooklyn, they were saying that this is not who should be represented on that pedestal, because psychologically, these are the images of, or stereotypically, these are the images of people who are, the dregs of our society. So it was removed.
Can I make another question, Andres? I'm sorry, I'm making all these questions. But Kendall, can you just, and sorry if this is inappropriate, but can you just very briefly explain how your organization works? I'm somewhat familiar with it, but would love just to get it straight, if that's all right.
That's great. So I run something called the Percent for Art program. And this program was created in the early 80s. It says that whenever the city is building something, whether it be a park, a building of any kind, where city funds, 1% of the construction of that project must go to the commissioning of a work of art. So in the case of this particular project, they were constructing a police station. And 1% of the funds for the police station was taken and to commission an artist to do a site-specific work for that police station. And so that was the result of that.
Interestingly, in Colombia for many years, several decades ago, there was a very, very similar program at a time in which the sort of a modernist geometric sculpture in Medellin was in rise. So if you go around Medellin, you'll see outside of many apartment buildings this great, large-scale geometric, often obviously hard metal works. But it disappeared. I don't know. I think like 20 years ago or something.
I think sadly that was only in Medellin. We didn't have the pleasure of having that program in Barranquilla. It is true. It is true of Medellin, for sure.
But at the same time, I feel it's a huge responsibility to put something out in the public space, and that a program, or an institution like yours actually, holds a lot of symbolic power, because finally you are dealing with a lot of issues that can be very controversial, I think, at the very least, no? And it requires a lot of sensibility and a lot of responsibility, and I think also a lot of empathy in trying to understand the different views, because going back to what you were saying, how to measure a successful work in the public space, it is a matter of consensus or adapting or talking into a situation that different views can be happy with, which is something that's increasingly less common and increasingly, I think, more challenging, and more complicated as we polarize, as we are ever less open to disagree, even, right?
Yeah, and I'll be interested to find out from you, why did your program that was similar to my program not existing anymore? What was the reasoning behind that?
I think it was just a political decision, because, also at the time in which all the sculptures were being installed, I think very few of them had many of them were more interested in art or art historical related issues. So, composition and form and art historical references and tradition and things like that, rather than very poignant either political or social things. So, it wouldn't have been so much about the interests of different communities, but rather about, I think, either a financial tax-related decision through politics.
Yeah, because the program my program is has been. I'm surprised it's still surviving, mind you, but it has been attacked throughout the years. It was created when the city was relatively bankrupt in the early 80s. If you know anything about New York City, then it was a mess back then. And time and time again, until very recently, whenever there's a controversy, elected officials and certain people see it as an opportunity. Why are you doing this? and the argument is, and I'm sure you've heard this argument is, we have crime and we could use this money for other things, and that sort of, that other thing. And so, we have had to defend the program many times. Luckily, we have had great mayors and city council members who understand the value of this, and they understand the value of just culture in New York in general, to really support it despite negative outcry from other individuals. So that has been good.
What kind of freedom of decision, or how does the decision structure work in the Percent for Art program?
Okay, so this is taxpayer dollars, right? And so we have to be very transparent in whatever we do. And so we have what we call a panel process. And so for each project, we have a combination of arts professionals, because this is art really, and community stakeholders and elected officials that really sit down together and really look at, starting with like, what is this art meant to do, like I said before, and really look at the artists that is appropriate for the project and whatever that means. And once once the artists are coming in with proposals, and again, I'm sort of truncating the whole process really quickly here because it's a very long process. So we pay the artists to do proposals, and then we select from the proposals, but still work with the artists and the community to realize those proposals. Now, I want to make it very clear that though there's a huge community component within all this, we don't have the community designing the work. We don't have the artist determining what the community is, and we don't have the community deciding what the art is. So that's very important. Otherwise, we get a whole bunch of nonsense out there. That's designed by committee. Why pick an artist for their sensibility, for the work that they've been doing for many years, and then have some community people design it? That doesn't make any sense for us. So,
Emiliano, how does that contrast with your process in Medellin?
I mean, I think, our production or our presentation of public art is not as, I mean, it's one aspect of a more I don't know, varied program. So we don't do as much public art or in the public space as I think I and everybody at the museum would like us to do. And that has to do with several things. One is that working in the public space is extremely difficult, and it's also extremely expensive. And it's extremely difficult because the public space is one in which there's so many factors and so many actors and so many vectors of ideas and interests and monies and properties, and you have to deal with all of that because you cannot be in positive because you can't, and you have to deal with that bureaucracy of the public space in a way. With the bureaucracy of the public space, you also have to deal with the bureaucracy of the local administration because you have to work with them if you want to make these kinds of things happen. And it's also really expensive, because you have to do stuff that it's resistant and big, in some way that it's visible. Because if you do something that's really small, I mean, it can be also really powerful, but it's going to be, very, very, very subtle. And then we go back to that discussion about the scales and the amount of people that you impact and the conversations that you want to engage in. And so we do it, and we try to do it as much as we can. But it's it's by far not something that I would say it's a constant in our program. We do a few programs a year, and they usually take up a lot of our resources and our energy and also our money, and that's great. It's money and time and ideas really, really well spent, because going back to what I was saying at the beginning, it's probably going to be one of the few encounters with art that people are going to have, that some people are going to have along their lifetime. But I do wish we could do it more often. I do wish we had a stronger capacity to go out there and be more present in a space that's inhabited by people that it's going to be more difficult to bring into the museum. So, I mean, luckily, on the other hand, we are a private institution, and that gives us a lot of freedom in terms of the things that we do. I mean, it gives us the freedom, I suppose, like Kendall, to bring out things and to propose the ideas that we truly believe in and that we think are needed and are urgent and are, absolutely, urgent for that community and for that time. And then we need to build up this structure, this capacity to actually go out there and do it. So I think it's a matter of a lot of freedom versus challenges in practical terms. But, obviously challenges that we're happy to work with. And it's also, I think, a little random in the sense that you'll find people along the way that will engage with you and say, yeah, it's a great idea, let's go out and do that. And you'll find people in the administration that will not be bothered, because it's just work, and it just requires talking to people and spending long hours doing paperwork and explaining things to people why you want to do this when it's completely unnecessary, because like Kendall was saying, you could install, I don't know, like a water fountain or something more practical. So I do think it requires a huge amount of all of those things. But then you see that moment, in which somebody encounters something that sort of slightly challenges their assumptions about the public space or about art or about, their daily lives. And that, I think, makes all of that process really worth it.
Yeah, and I also want to say too is I'm glad you said it, because when you see a completed public artwork, you're like, oh my God, that's cool, or that's not cool, or whatever it is. But to administer a program, a public art project, even, you need to be an artist to some extent. You need to be a diplomat. You need to be a politician. You need to be a lawyer. You need to be a bureaucrat. You need to be all these things at any given time because of the work that it takes to sort of, engage in the process of doing something that's outside of a building that you have control over. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because yeah, it does take a lot. But if it's done right, and if it's done well, the benefits are incredible, particularly for your community, because again, and that's what, most of the artists that I work with for the permanent artwork, I work with them for about 3 years on average. At the end of that, I have two types of artists at the end of that. One is like, I'm never doing this again, ever. And the other is like, oh my God, I want to try this again. This is incredible. So it's always interesting to see how, because it's a lot of work, and because sometimes the benefits are really high or not so much. So thanks for mentioning that.
And it's not only, I think, a lot of work, but it can also be incredibly frustrating because the stakes are high. As I was saying, the amount of things that you need to put into it are big. So when it doesn't come out the way you expected it, it can be incredibly frustrating, for many parts involved. I mean, the funders, the artists, the institution, the curator. But at the same time, sometimes, as you say, it's when it happens, it's so powerful to put that like spark out there.
I think you both have been speaking about two things that maybe we haven't really touched on. I don't know in which order we can tackle them. One of them relates to what we were just saying, and it's about who is financing this public art, right? Who is making these decisions? Especially nowadays where there's been a lot of privatization of the public sphere. I mean, I've seen it in Colombia. A lot of new public spaces and new public artworks are being financed and built and decided by the private industry. And I've lived it in New York as well. A lot of the city amenities have been in a way privatized, right? So that's one side of the equation. The other side is the public it is being catered to, or what you mentioned earlier, Kendall, about a popularity of an artwork versus the sort of the real value of the artwork, and who is it popular to? And I think a good example would be the vessel, Thomas Heatherwick's vessel in New York, which is very controversial because tourists love it, but New Yorkers don't like it that much, right?
Okay, how should I tackle this one? So one of the things that we have recognized as a city is that exactly what you're saying. All the public spaces for many different reasons, but in New York City, most of the land is owned by two city departments: Department of Transportation, they own all the sidewalks and the streets, and the Departments of Parks and Recreation, which is owns the parks. So these are basically our public spaces, and we don't have many places to gather. To make these spaces take care of themselves, we have something called BIDs, Business Improvement Districts, that take care of the sites within a business district, let's say, or we have the plaza programs that's taken care of by entities within that particular community. So if an artist is trying to come in there to do something, they have to go through this whole rigmarole to do something, and it ends up benefiting that business or that entity or that company or whatever. So what we try to do is to sort of leave a bit of space for any artist to sort of come in and propose to do different programs within those spaces, to give, and in essence, to give these public spaces back to the artists and back to the community. And each of the agencies have a program that does that. The Department of Transportation's program is called Art Inventions, where any artist could come in and say, I want to propose something, and I'm on the committee for that. We look at it and we determine, we look at it for artistic quality, but not for content, because we don't want to be able to control content. Otherwise, the content is all about what we think is appropriate. So we look at it for, is it safe? Would it last as long as it's supposed to be lasting without falling apart and killing somebody? That sort of thing. And we try to get, and we even provide insurance, which is huge, to do these things in our streets and sidewalks. And so what we're seeing now is it now allows for a good variety of the types of art that we're presenting. So my agency does permanent art on a large scale. We have other agencies or other entities like Creative Time, Public Art Fund, No Longer Empty, all these smaller organizations that do things in the public environment that really speaks to communities or actual locations. And we have these other ones in the parks that speak to the smaller individual artists. And so when you look at it as a whole, you see a good variety, and you see, there's something speaking to everyone. And I think that's very, very important. That is not necessarily the case. This is, I think, is quite special here in New York, where we allow for that to happen without controlling completely and without controlling content. Even when we commission our works, we don't require, or we don't put forth an idea of a theme to the artist. The artist needs to come up with his or her own theme. The Department of Cultural Affairs, where my program is in, we fund all the cultural entities within the city, and content does not apply to, whether you get funding or not, which is also important. So all this to say is, if you want to make a change, the best way to change is to sort of get into the organization itself and influence it that way. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It's not going to change at all. So this is a long-winded way of answering a quick question, but this is what I'm trying to say here.
Emiliano, have you dealt with similar situations that involve sort of a private sphere and public sphere? I mean, I guess you do, because you work in a private entity that operates in a way as a public entity.
Yes, continuously. I mean, absolutely all the time. We are, in fact, private institution, but we have this sort of public nature, and so we need to relate, I suppose, very carefully with all sides. I mean, with the private sector, because to a large extent they make our programs possible, but also with the public sector, because we cater to we'd like to think just about anybody who wants to come to the museum, but also with the local administration, because we are obviously an institution that sort of plays a role in the cultural scene, and so we are partners even in certain programs, and obviously to the audiences, which are finally to the artists and the audiences, which are the reason we exist. I think in our case, perhaps the slight difference is that our well, I guess it depends. I mean, it depends in projects. I think in projects that are as big or as ambitious or significant as the ones Kendall develops are, that idea of freedom is absolutely necessary. And I feel that when we're working at that scale, which is not so often, which I think, could in our case more sort of relate to making an exhibition with an artist or commissioning a work in a different circumstance. What you really want to put forward is the vision of the artist, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot less about you or your institution or your vision or your interests than what the artists really have to say. I mean, we are right now, and one of the reasons that I was, a few minutes late to the rehearsal is that we're doing this series of, we've called them, I think I mentioned performatic lectures, and it's really about the artists helping us understand the moment that we're living. We're really interested in that vision, and I think that is true for the public space as well. It's looking at the figure of an artist as somebody that can give you feedback and can give you tools to understand, a particular moment or a particular situation or that particular issue that he or she is addressing. And I think freedom combined with that sort of follow up in the sense that, will it last and will it be able to dialogue with these different situations or not is really, our job. I mean, that's exactly how I understand it. I think in a slightly different scale and perhaps with some also cultural differences and precisions, but I completely agree. I mean, that's exactly the way we see it.
Yeah, and why else would you have an artist be part of that process in the first place if you don't have their voices? So, that's how we see it as well. So,
yeah, you might as well just do it yourself,
Yeah. So it shows you, even in New York and in Colombia, different cultures, we have the same ideas and same thoughts and approaches. So there you go.
I think we have a couple of minutes left, and given that we are broadcasting from a local university, from a city that, let's say, is only restarting its public art programs and restarting or beginning to get back into the public sphere, what would be some words of advice in order to sort of promote public artwork, or what would be the best way to go at it?
Well, I would have advice for two groups of people. The ones in power, the ones who hold the purse, so to speak. Give artists an opportunity and trust that, and there's nothing wrong with experimentation. One of the things that we always try to do is say, let's call it a pilot project. Let's just see what can come out of engaging an artist in a public environment, and use that as a learning. As a mechanism for learning. If it doesn't work out, why didn't it work out? And what can we learn from that? And sort of use that knowledge to do something else or to sort of move forward. So to the people who hold the power, I would say, well, artists have a very unique perspective and a unique voice that transcends language and understanding. So please use them in that way. Pay them, but use them in that way to do that. For artists, I would say, go experiment in the public environment. You work in your studio, you do work from thinking about it in a museum or a gallery. Why not try to, I encourage you to sort of engage a different type of audience. People who come to museums and galleries are very, art-centric, and they're going for that stimuli. But, what would it be like to have that conversation with your work with people who don't necessarily care, who don't want to see your work? What would you learn from that? So, I always encourage artists to sort of just do a small intervention in the public environment and see what that looks like, see what you learn from that about your work, about the people that you live around. So that would be my advice.
And my advice would be to a third group of people, perhaps the audience, the people that are maybe listening, that are neither artists, not the people in power. And it's make the art your own, you know, go out there, touch it, see it, feel it, inquire about it, ask about it, like it, think about it, talk about it, you know, protest if you don't like it. I think often there is this sense that whatever is put out there is maybe because of the history of monuments and things like that. People feel that it's something that it's really not about them, you know, and it doesn't have to do with their daily lives or their experiences. And I think luckily we're moving into more and more into a time in which it does. And the way for those artworks to make sense out there is by people relating to them. So if you see a sculpture, or you see a performance in the public space, or you see anything, go out, or a mural, you know, go and look at it and think about it and inquire about it, you know, ask who the artist is, when it was done, what it's about. It might just turn out to be something that really relates to you.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are all great advices. I mean, I think that the pilot art project is a very interesting way. I've never thought about it, to be honest.
Yeah, we do that for everything. We just call everything a pilot so people don't complain about it too much. And then that's the secret I'm giving you right now. We call it pilot.
Making a note.
Guys, sorry that I'm interrupting like this from the backstage. We do have a backstage in this whole production. I just wanted to thank you guys again for joining us, but I want to open the floor to whomever has a question in the audience. If anybody wants to ask something, now it's the time. Afterwards, you'll still be able to ask, but not the same people here. So if anybody has a question, they can put it in the comment. If not, I don't know if Andy has anything else. I wanted to add to what Kendall and Emiliano were saying about the advices that we are now listening to about the future of art in public space. And one of the things that is very interesting to me as director of the cultural area of the university is that whatever we do today in 50 years from now can be equally challenged and questioned in the same way. And even though we might think that what we're doing today, questioning those monuments and those that art that's been placed, whatever we do with the best intentions, even today, can be questioned 50 years from now, and that'll be fine. Because I think that the fact remains that maybe all this is very elastic, and it should be very elastic in the way that it's placed and then removed and then placed again. So that's one of the things that we have very much in mind when it comes to proposing things in public space in the university. And there are some people in Barranquilla and the Caribbean that are doing interesting stuff, albeit in a very independent and small and experimental way. Because as you said, Kendall, everything they do, because of the scope they do it, it's pretty much a pilot. They have nothing to lose. And that, I think, is the best situation that you can be in if you're an artist, is having nothing to lose. So we try to promote that. We try to keep artists thinking that they have nothing to lose so they can experiment to their heart's content. So if there's no questions from the audience, you should be making questions, because then you're questioning things, okay? Question things now, goddamn. If not, Andy, I don't know if you have anything else, but this has been a very illustrious conversation for me, at least. It's been very, very interesting.
I think, I mean, this has been a very interesting conversation. It's been great to have you here, Kendall. Great to have you here, Emiliano. Like Tony said, I think these are exciting times, if anything. I mean, public art is growing, it's transforming, and what's happening right now with all the monuments in the United States, I think many people have focused on the racial issue, which is very important. But what you were saying, which is the fact that we can revisit and revise and actually take down not just a monument, but any art or anything in the public space is quite a new notion, and it's very exciting.
It's very liberating, right? In a way.
And that's actually something that we're playing with right now, even with the ones that we're commissioning right now, to sort of put in place a review in 10 years and to sort of reevaluate what that means at that time. And so yeah, we haven't gotten there yet, but it's a good thing to. I know some programs have already instituted that idea, but yeah, why not? Everything should be elastic.
And I hope. There's a question last minute. Raise of the hand before we dismiss class. They're asking that if the citizenry should be involved in the decisions made for art in public space. So should it be like an obligation in a way of the citizenry to have opinions about what is going to go up?
Yeah. This work is being created not in a vacuum, not for, this is, being created for the citizens. So they should on some level have some input as to what it is that's being done. And so that I know that's a quick and easy way to answer that question, but there's a lot of different ways that I think that the public could be involved with, with that to sort of understanding what is this art meant to be, for example, to really being part of the process of selecting the artist, let's say, where it's sort of a democratic component of it. So, but the people who are doing the work, the people who are the arts administrators, need to provide a good, sustainable idea as to the level of professionalism within that to give the citizen an opportunity. So let me explain what that means. So putting forth really appropriate artists, professional artists, for example, and then, having the citizen be part of that versus having the folks who don't know anything about art per se pick the artists, where it's a little difficult, it's a different kind of situation. Because in the end, you want a good work of art, but then you also want people to be part of that selection process, let's say. And the selection is just one idea I'm putting forward here, but there are many different ways that people could be engaged in that, from where it's located to, what it means to, because again, in the end, it's their money, really. So.
Sure. Yeah. There you go. That's
so in a way, it should not be a popularity
contest.
Contest.
Yeah, that doesn't work really well. That doesn't work really well. And I've seen that over and over again. So, there's room for everybody's voice to be heard, but then I think there's an appropriate place for each person's voice to be heard. There's a part of the process where I want to hear from the community, or I want to hear from the artists, I want to hear from the elected officials. There's a appropriate place for that. And to understand within your communities or within your way of working in government, whatever, you need to find what that is. There's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but people need to understand that they're being heard. And
well, I can see a reality show in the make, for Bravo TV. Choose your next monument, sort of thing. Who do you want to bust up? And just for the record about this chats that we're doing about public art or art in public space, we're going to continue this sort of series, and we're going to have, in 3 weeks, we're going to have a more sort of not local, but regional conversation about what it's being done. And we're going to invite, of course, people from the City Hall and from the governor's office to talk a little bit about what is it that they have in mind when it comes to policies for public art. So we want to keep this going, and this is a great start to this sort of series about urbanism and architecture and art in public space and just curation in general. So hopefully this will be the first, not the last time we see each other, and Kendall will be in Colombia soon doing some sort of site-specific stuff for a Museum of Modern Art in Medellin or the Museum of Modern Art in Barranquilla. And yes, Emiliano, that's me putting you in the spot. And,
I'd love to have that conversation, obviously, of course.
Yeah. We'll have a conversation. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Again, Andy for moderating. This chat will be up for future references. So whatever questions you didn't do now, you can leave them in the comments. So have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Kendall. Thanks, Emiliano. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good one.